So now let's look into maybe a little bit deeper on some of those points a little bit, but also why does it matter? So, Jordan, where do you want to go from here? Do you want to explain maybe a couple of those points a little bit more, or do we just want to go into why does it matter?
Let's go into why it matters. And the points come up, the points come up. But let's talk about why it matters. The first thing that I think matters about all this is that, Ben, can I steal your phrase? Will you forgive me if I
Yes.
steal your phrase?
Yep.
So in pre-show, Ben was writing notes, and he coined this so perfectly. He goes, to some extent, fundamentalism is a time capsule theology, which is
Mhm.
just beautiful. So Ben, I
Thank
feel
you.
I actually feel guilty explaining it. Please tell them what you mean by that.
Okay. So the reason I called it a theological time capsule is because so much of its ideas are based around the late 1800s, early 1900s worldview and different ideas that are present there that just they're not applicable anymore. It's like whenever I listen to fundamentalism, or when I hear fundamentalist preachers, or when I hear different ideas, or anything like that, it's like I'm listening to a voice from the early 20th century. It's very strange. It's like the theology itself, and I know I'm probably sounding very disrespectful. I'm just trying to be honest. It like a good example is the debate between Bill Nye and Ken Ham, where it was like you didn't have two respected scientists debating how creation happened. You had a fairly tame scientific representation of the 21st
Yeah,
century
Bill Nye, the
and
science guy,
and the
the most
developments in the
child-friendly guy
scientific
ever.
community, and understandings of biology and science and meteorology and geology and stuff like that. And then you had this other person who was a voice from the late 1800s, before any of those sciences really started to develop, before Darwin wrote his Origin of Species. And it was a joke. I mean, it really was. Even a lot of Christians saw that and were just embarrassed, because here's this guy who's supposed to represent, I mean, in his view, the Christian view, but it's fundamentalism, and this science guy who really his scientific background is not that strong, but he just wipes the floor with Ken Ham because they're working from such different worldviews. But it's not just a matter of different worldviews. It's that the knowledge base that Ken Ham is drawing from is over 100 years old,
Mm.
and it's like it's stuck in this this time, so it's very weird. And like some of the theological issues that were present at that time are just not present anymore, or we just understand them differently. But fundamentalism, it is, uh, as an aspect of what it is incapable of evolving, and I do mean that like with a pun. It is incapable of evolving. Um, but because of like the stances that it takes, it just cannot adapt to the different conversations that have developed in the last 100 years.
Yeah.
And so when you look at fundamentalism, it's like stepping back in time.
When
So
I
that's why I call it a theological time capsule.
No, it's really accurate. When I think of fundamentalism to some extent, and this is, I don't want this to sound insulting, but it just kind of reminds me of this. I moved to Colorado and I learned to ski recently. Um, and so one of the things that sometimes they make beginner skiers do is not use the little poles. Sometimes I feel like fundamentalism is like a beginner skier with the poles that's a little scared of the momentum and the direction that the hill's going and the steepness of it. And they just stick their poles in the ground, like, and they just can't move forward. And they tell you not to do that because you can actually break your wrists and get really hurt. But that's almost kind of what it feels like. Some ways, like as a metaphor, like in some ways, like they're so like they're so far up that mountain, you know what I mean? That like you
Mhm.
can't even communicate with them because you're so far much further downhill. And maybe the metaphor for the fundamentalist is like being like, haha, you're downhill, you know what I mean? But maybe that's the road that we ought to be going down, or maybe that's just kind of like
Mhm.
the road that we live in. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's inherently evil. It's just kind of the way the momentum was carrying us. And some of the stuff from modernism we've rejected or polished up enough to where, like, hey, some of the harmful effects we've mitigated and moved on from. Some of them we're still trying to figure out. But that deep line in the sand was really interesting because it felt like it picked and chose, so to speak, what those were. I know that's a faulty analogy, but do you get what I'm saying, Ben? Like it's just
Mhm.
they're holding on to something to the point where like it's killing, in my mind, some of the ability to minister. and to have a meaningful conversation, but also is
Mhm.
kind of like self-damaging because like how if you have an 1800s education in 2021, like yo, come on,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
you're almost limited on what you can do career wise to some extent. Like half of the
Yeah.
hard sciences are gone to you. I mean, you can
Mhm.
program, but like even then, like you might get into some of those theories. Physics is unavailable, so like engineering would be difficult. Um, do
Yeah.
you know what I'm
Well, the
saying?
interesting thing, yeah, the interesting thing too is it's not just that it's stuck in a time and it can't move forward. It's also interesting because it has no ties to the time that came before it either,
Yeah, it's true.
because they reject the forms of Christianity that came before the 1800s. Even other Protestant traditions. So I'm not talking about they're just anti-Catholic, which they very much
Yeah,
are,
super anti-Catholic.
anti-Orthodox. They don't really say much about Orthodox or Coptic, but they're against them. They're also against other forms of Protestantism. So it's weird. It's like the church has been going on for 1800 years, and then this new group of people is born, and they're born and they just stay there.
So like we're
So
traditional, but
so
all your tradition, you're all wrong.
Yeah. So, I mean, I just say it to clarify because I know the fundamentalist position is no, we're preserving the actual true Christianity, which is
A half truth at best.
false. Yeah, because they're really just preserving 1800s Christianity.
Well,
And,
late
and not even
1800s,
just
yeah.
that, 1800s American British
Yeah.
forms of popular Christianity at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And
So
yeah.
so it's very interesting in that way too.
A couple other things that I think matter, Ben, and I want to hear your thoughts on this is because of that hard line and that inability to be flexible, like they deny like any kind of analytical, scientific, or even historical truths that can't
Mhm.
fit within their worldview. And like that doesn't seem like a big deal because like I all right, this isn't supposed to be political, but just hear me out.
Mhm.
In America, like we're really big on you can believe whatever you want. And that's fine. It's a discussion we're having right now as a society. Having said that, like it makes it hard to communicate and function and move forward when you guys can't even agree on a common set of facts. So like think about the mission of the church as an evangelical. Like they're asking people to become indoctrinated and to lose thinking and to like think less and to like engage less and know less
Mhm.
rather than to like embrace the faith and let it enrich your life. Like it's like if you adhere to this doctrine rather than these other alternatives, it's almost like going to the supermarket and we're just like, hey, we have the best product. Why? Because it's the best product. Duh. You know what I mean? Like, you know,
It's like, well, the place down the street has better ham than you guys do, and it's like, no, 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 but that's not real ham.
it's
That's
not
fake
Ken.
ham.
That's not,
We
not
we
Ken.
have Ken ham.
Yeah. Um,
I wasn't even trying to set that up.
you just threw me the alley oop I had to dunk. And that's I know we were trying to take it seriously, and I know it's mean, but like I mean, you explained it so well. Like I refuse to watch that debate between Ken Ham and Bill Nye because I refuse to accept that as a Christian person as being representative of Christianity. I just can't do it because it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing because it doesn't even advocate for Christianity as a viable like
Mhm.
intellectual worldview. You know what I mean? Like I have so many friends who have left the church, and one of the things is because they grew up with like neo fundamentalist church or full fundamentalist churches, excuse me, and like it it was hard for them. Like we have trouble as friends dialoguing specifically about religion. Like
Mhm.
I'm open about my faith and I'm fairly like into apologetics, and I think I can make a decent case for why, at the very least, Christianity is not an irrational worldview. But that's something that we can't take because their fundamental view of truth in Christianity is all or nothing, so to speak. You know what I mean? Like it's either all this and that's the fundamentals, or you can't be a Christian. So to
Mhm.
debate and argue for anything else isn't even talking about Christianity. So they rejected that movement and just kind of rejected all Christianity with it because their only knowledge of Christianity is this or nothing. And
Yeah.
it's really, I think it's a big deal, and I think you're seeing a lot of like negative blowback from that. And then the thing with that is because fundamentalists tend to be loud voices, like Westboro Baptist Church. Maybe you heard of Stephen
Mhm.
L. Anderson. Um, I don't want to pick another YouTube beef. He won't even care. Spencer Smith is another guy. You know what I mean? They
Yeah.
have big reach.
We did a response to his Ash Wednesday video. At the time, I didn't realize he was a fundamentalist until I saw that video because I'd followed some of his stuff, but not a lot of it. But he actually has a video out there that explains fundamentalism. Although I should clarify, at this point, there are many different branches of fundamentalism,
Yeah.
but they're all consistent on what we've talked about so far. So yeah, but fundamentalism is very insulated. They don't even associate with other Christians that do not agree with their views because they say they
Well, we're
are
not Christians.
unorthodox. Yeah, it's very much a believe before you belong type of Christianity.
Yeah. Um, Yeah, that's really well said. No, I don't have any other addition to that. And I just think that like it's a dangerous place when you start denying science. Cuz like to me it feels like a really weird place because in one sense like think about all the modern scientific advancements that have created medicine since that time. Like
Mm.
if you're a fundamentalist and like you like McDonald's and you eat too much McDonald's and you got to like have a heart surgery, like it just feels weird. It almost feels weird that you're okay with that, but are also like, hey, all the stuff you believe is wrong, but somehow you got this one right. You're lucky. You know what I mean? Well, they're pretty
Yeah.
lucky a lot, dude. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I think it's hard too because one of the things I say in my Genesis study is like when you actually begin to study scripture, like even if you just study it as a piece of literature, and I hope I don't come across that I do that, but sometimes it is really helpful because then you can better understand the theology that's in it
Hmm.
and the beliefs that we can derive from it. And one of the things I say in there is by reading specifically the creation accounts, literally, you actually miss out on some incredibly significant theological claims that it makes that reveal to us how incredible God is and our place in creation and the value of humanity. That if you just read it literally, you miss all of that.
Yep.
So it's yeah, it's tough when it forces when you have a belief system that forces you to interpret scripture in a particular way and there's no other way to interpret it. It actually devalues the text. When fundamentalism seeks to uphold the authority and the value of the text, it actually undermines it by
Yeah,
doing
I
that.
agree. I mean, like think about like books like Jonah, which a
Mm,
lot of people I think is literal, but like especially fundamentalists. But like, there's even some interpretations of seeing it as parody and how it communicates a different message to understanding God. There's been some like, academic discussions on that, and
mm,
some of those interpretations really paint like a really beautiful theological picture of like suffering and justice and what that truly means for the ancient Hebrews and how we can understand it as Christians. But you can't even wrestle with those themes in any way. You know what
mm.
I mean? If you
Yeah.
don't take the story literally. And it's kind of weird because, you know, God's pretty forgiving and then pretty mean in that story at the same time. And it's weird. And if you don't understand it as parody or satire in some extent, it gets a little difficult. Or if you don't understand like maybe some of the like the tropes or thematic elements of like wisdom literature, you might
Mm.
miss out on some of the like implications of that. And I'm not saying that
Like
you
the story of Job, for example.
yeah,
The
exactly.
story of
Oh, did I
Job
say
read
Jonah? I said a
literally.
Job. Oh my goodness, I said that backwards.
Oh,
I said the
that's
names
okay.
wrong.
That's okay.
I was thinking
Yeah,
Job.
I Job breaks my heart because reading it literally forces you to completely ignore the conclusion that it's trying to get to.
Yeah.
It's really trying to get to the same conclusion as Ecclesiastes, but it does so in a slightly different way. Well, not a slightly, a
Hey, how does
very
a
different
literalist
way.
read of
And it's
Ecclesiastes?
it is a fascinating story, and it hurts because every time I've heard Job preached on, even nowadays, and I know the person preaching on it is doing so in a literal manner, they completely miss the point and they reduce it. I mean, essentially, if you want to read Job as a fundamentalist, read the first, I think, 2 chapters, cut out the next 40, and then read the end. Because that's all that matters to a fundamentalist literal interpretation. I mean, it really does. Because those are the only conclusions you can get to. And those are the only conclusions I've ever heard on the story of Job. You just cut out everything in the middle, cut out all the dialogues, all of that. Sorry.
No, you're good. I'm
That's a
embarrassed that
bit of
I
a
confused
soapbox for
Job
me.
and Jonah, and I feel like really dumb. But I
It's
was
okay.
thinking Job, and I was literally like hearing the story in my head while I was saying Jonah. So it feels really dumb.
That's
But
okay.
you're right, Ben. Like that's what I was highlighting. Like understanding it as either satire or something, other thematic elements like wisdom literature or something totally different, like a different genre, can unlock that. And being willing to even have that discussion is a big deal. So, and that's what I'm talking about. When you deny truth you deny God's communication into your life, because all truth is God's truth, period. If we
Mhm.
believe in one true God and a being that created the universe and he's omnipotent and omniscient, omnipresent, like, hey, he's probably going to know those things, and maybe there was some intention in those designs, like, you know what I mean, like
Yeah.
maybe like there's some like teleology to this world if you believe that's true, and that like we actually are moving towards something, and that actually enhances some of those beliefs by understanding that there's a purpose and a structure and a direction for our universe. But hey, what do I know? The
Mhm.
next thing that I think, well, Ben, did you have anything else to say about like how that can hurt scientific, historical, or even analytical truths?
Um, no, not now.
Not now. Oh, I'm
Not
sorry.
now. I'll save some for later.
Okay.
No, I meant like there's some stuff I could think of, but I don't want to share it now.
Okay. All
So
right.
that's a teaser to listen in coming episodes.
Ooh, I'm excited. I'm officially teased. Um, so the next thing that you'll notice, the next thing that you'll see a lot in with fundamentalists, especially nowadays, is that they have some pretty deep political ties.
Mhm.
And they can be fairly, and actually fairly is the wrong word, they are extremely nationalistic, and almost exclusively they're American. And it's always
Yeah.
like America, 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 America.
Mhm.
Ben, I know you have an example from our good friend Spency Smith.
Yeah. I will just say though, you're right. This is almost exclusively American. I'm not familiar with our friends on the other side of the pond. Maybe this is present there and I'm just not familiar with it because I haven't heard of anything of it. But
I
it's
don't
definitely
think they have the
true in
same
America.
nationalist streak in there.
Yeah. I
The,
wonder how much of that was due to the world wars. Because the world wars definitely affirmed fundamentalism in the States. I don't know what it did to fundamentalism in Britain.
well, it really hurt religion in general and in all of Europe, including the UK. I mean, like, this is something that I think is a really interesting point. I've read some pieces on this for both World War One and Two, but
Mhm.
specifically World War One. Like the reason that neo Orthodox theology comes in, one of the big problems that they're addressing, and even C.S. Lewis personally served in World War One, by the way. One of the things they're addressing is like the problem of evil, because they just watched like the rise of like gas weapons, and like
Mhm.
they're literally like in these hometowns, like people are dying and things that are really dangerous are going on. And then when World War II starts, right, we have like Hitler amassing power and like the murder of Jews, and like that's pretty dark stuff. And like as Americans, we see it, like we didn't have social media, so it's like not trending on Twitter, right? So like these are newspaper headlines from people that are being like getting reports to the military from what's being able to, what they can disclose. So if there's like military intelligence they can't hear, they can't get full reports. Small TV programs that you watch once a day, if there's even TV radio highlights, and stuff like that. So there's not like the information about it that Americans are hearing are really different than the European experience.
Yeah.
Because like Europeans are seeing like cities,
Yeah.
cathedrals, homes, fields,
Mhm.
farms being destroyed, and soldiers marching on and like fighting in the name of whatever country.
Yeah. And I should have clarified when I meant that the World Wars affirmed fundamentalism in the States. I meant that they saw fundamentalism saw it as an affirmation of their beliefs.
Somehow it bolstered their
Um,
faith.
yeah, yeah. But you're right. Like, because that was the thing too, is they, especially after World War II, um, the view of America was that we are here to stomp out evil. Like that is our role. And so fundamentalism definitely became more ingrained, especially with the conservative right. Even our friend Spencer Smith says you can't, if you are a fundamentalist, you have to be politically conservative.
Yeah,
You might not be active politically, but you have to vote that way because it's about preserving America's Christian heritage.
yeah,
And that's the only way we can be a force for good in the world. And that I'm curious how much that plays into the fact that America did not have to live with anything beyond Pearl Harbor. And I wonder if that could be a difference between America and Britain, because Britain had to deal with a lot of fallout, like
hmm
infrastructure rebuilding and stuff, as an effect of World War II. Whereas America, all we like, yeah, we lost people, and that was really tragic. But our soldiers were able to come home, and everything was normal. So it really was seen as we're going to fight evil, and
this is
that was
God's land.
Germany. Like the
Yeah,
evil was not the war necessarily. The evil was Germany. But we escaped a lot of the long-term effects of like
yeah,
the damage of what war can really do
yeah.
to a country.
Yeah. Well, like
So
you
I mean that's
described
just
it perfectly. Like
yeah.
that we send our people off. Like we parents sent their kids to the war. The kids got drafted. They went to Germany, Italy, wherever, and fought people.
Mhm.
Italians had the same thing. Their kids went to the war. It just also happened to be like 60 miles up the road,
Yeah.
maybe less. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? And then sometimes it would be in your town, in your city, in your village. And so you have to go to a bomb shelter and run with like a big public housing. And you know that your son or daughter, or excuse me, your son, most likely at this point in time, is out there somewhere, either in this troop, defending the town, trying to stave off like these tanks. And so like the realness of that evil and the danger, like you said, like that's the evil of war. You see, like, why are we doing this? This is so crazy. We're shooting each other, and you see it up close. Versus us, we're like, no, we're stamping out evil, but like it's not real unless you were there. And if your kid didn't come home, that's really sad, but they were doing it for the good of it. Whereas, like, I think Europe was asking different questions. They were like,
Yeah.
why?
Mhm.
Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, that's just speculation.
I mean, there's been a lot of research on that, or at least a lot of like publishing on that.
Yeah. Um, I would be curious though how much that affected the fundamentalist movement in Britain. But anyways, all that to say, yes, fundamentalism does have very deep political ties, and for better for worse,
Yeah.
very nationalistic.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
interpret some of those Revelation passages, and even Isaiah, as like you sometimes even using the eagle as representative of America, and
Yeah.
the Antichrist figure is why you constantly hear them calling people like Obama, or Joe Biden, or
Yeah. Or
before
even
that
before
Bill
them,
Clinton.
like actual countries
Yeah,
like Russia is Gog and Magog and China.
yeah,
But
exactly.
those are like the political enemies of the states, right?
Yeah, exactly. This is
Um,
what's going. Well, at least as they perceive them to be at that point. There
yeah, yeah, exactly.
depends on your foreign policy.
Which I mean, they are. Like there's political tensions. We have very different worldviews, very different political systems. Yeah, we're somewhat friendly, like we engage in trade and stuff, but there's obviously tensions. Um, but anyways, all that to say, yeah, through the lens of fundamentalism, like America as a
We're
country
righteous.
is, yes,
It's why you saw the rise. It's part of the reason you see, if you're not familiar with this, like the rise of, I don't know how to say this without being pejorative, but like the Trump like savior propaganda. Like if you've seen
yeah.
those shirts where
I mean,
like,
that's fair. Like,
yeah,
we're not discounting people who support Trump. Like, we're talking about like the
like,
movement that saw him as like the second coming of Christ,
yeah,
like
or
as a
like,
religious figure.
yeah, as like, oh, he's going to be like the one that ushers in like whatever era or something,
Yeah.
it gets to, in my opinion, bad exegetical interpretations of scripture. But moreover, like, I don't know. I just feel at some point you'd think fundamentalists would get tired of grasping at straws. That sounds really mean, but like I just feel like a lot of times, like you hear in fundamentalist circles, and it's almost kind of like that QAnon thing. If you've watched that documentary, like like no matter what, they just like keep seeing like uh, keep seeing the signs, and it's like, well, no, you've been wrong every time, man. Like I know you didn't like Obama. You don't, whatever your opinions on Obama are fine. He clearly was not the Antichrist, right? He's out of office. He's, you know what I mean? Like like no one, like the rapture didn't happen, at least not that I'm aware of. And like none of us are like burning,
Yeah.
and Nikolai Carpathia didn't reemerge from the husk of Obama. It didn't happen.
Yeah. Well, that's the frustrating thing about how fundamentalism interacts with politics
Yeah,
is
exactly.
you can't just not like someone. Like it's not enough to just be like, yeah, I'm not a huge fan of Obama. I really don't like Biden or his policies. Like it has to have religious motivation to it. It's
Yeah,
this really weird thing that happens. It's like it's not enough to just, prefer one political party over the other. There has to be religious motivation to it,
yeah,
which is very strange and very uncomfortable. And the sad thing is, a lot of these movements get very public attention, and it frames how a lot of unchurched people view Christianity as a whole.
yeah.
Because they think, oh, this is what all Christians are like. Like all Christians are Trump supporters. And you see that a lot. Like a
Well,
lot of
statistically,
like
most of a
there's
vast majority of them are.
yeah, but well, evangelicals.
Fair. You're right. You're right. You're right.
Yeah. But there's like even like atheist groups that are so framed by this that they think the whole QAnon thing is just evangelicals. Because, well, that must be the entire Christian perspective. It's like, well, no, it's just that tends to be a very loud voice
Yeah,
because
exactly.
fundamentalism is very prevalent
Yeah.
and very vocal.
Well, I mean, that's a great example. Like, let's think about Westboro Baptist Church, though, and the consequences. This is why it matters, though. This is why we're talking about it, because we want people to be aware of it and know and like how to
Yeah.
correct that when that's misnomer comes up. But like, remember when Westboro Baptist Church was like the big deal, like in like 2000, like 2000 to like 2010, probably is when they peaked in that range somewhere in that 10-year period, and they were like
Mhm.
always going like God hates, the word for that they called gay people the slur that I won't say,
Cigarettes.
sure those that
I guess it's
exactly.
the British word for cigarette.
Yes, it is. But like like and like that kind of stuff, like the end is coming, and like they just like they would just go places and protests, and it was just it wasn't violent physically, but it was violent verbally. You know what I mean? And it was just really hurtful. Like it was actually like I felt embarrassed. You know what I mean? At times watching
Yeah.
some of that, like as a Christian, I was like, no, like dude, don't throw one my Savior's name in the mud, and two, please don't drag me with you. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? Because remember that this is the group that's saying this is the Christian perspective. And so if you don't have like a deep, like a real meaningful theological training to understand, differentiate fundamentalism, or like your even own denominate, like your own traditional system, like whether you're like, Presbyterian, Nazarene, Catholic, whatever. Well, I guess you would be Catholic because different story. But the rest of the evangelicals, right? So like, newspaper guy, a journalist, and I'm not trying to get into news, but like, a journalist doesn't need an extensive background generally to cover a news event, especially a political journalist, right? Uh,
Mhm.
in like theology, that he goes to, the Senate passing a bill, the state Senate passing a bill in Kansas to write a story on, for his local paper in Kansas City. And who does he see there? But Westboro Baptist Church saying God hates, cigarettes and, abortion does this and all those things, right? And like,
Mhm.
that's now a story that's going on and underlying like, well, this is new, people don't typically go protest and say these things, you know what I mean? I need to write like I as a news reporter, I should write a story about this, you know what I
Mhm.
mean? So if you come up with the fake news stuff, I just think you're really dehumanizing journalists because they're just trying to do their jobs like the rest of us. But my whole point is this, that like that they're just trying to respond, and so then they have to propagate this and it becomes mass. And it's not disinformation as I call misinformation, right?
Mhm.
That they don't have the training to know the difference, and the rest of us as Christians were loud enough, we were uncomfortable or fearful or not loud enough in our way of saying, no, that's them. The rest of
Mhm.
us are okay. And
Yeah.
then maybe even to some extent, too many of us were actually okay with what they were saying. I don't know, but I don't think that last part's as true as the first two are. Does that make sense, Ben?
Yeah, it does. It
Cool.
does. And some of that stems from another point, which is it goes back to the review of end times or eschatology, which the fundamentalist view is that we are entering, depend on what sort of circle you're in, we are entering or we are currently in a tribulation period, which is supposed to see a rise in anti Christian sentiment
The
and
rise of
activity,
secularism.
and that Christ will come back at the end of this and vindicate everyone, and will be, well, again, depending on your circle, you'll be raptured out of it before the real tribulation happens. This is just a ramping up point, and that particular view, and it is a particular view. That is not the be all end all of our view of end times, but that definitely
For the record,
shape.
it's on the edge of possible heresy. I think that we should say that.
Yeah, it is. It's really not consistent with like
Historically what the
actual
church has
church
taught.
teaching.
Yeah.
Yeah. But fundamentalists don't care because whatever. But that really affects how we approach other people, because it gives this sense of self validation
It's a lifeboat.
whenever people are critical, because it's
Mm.
like, oh well, my truth is the real truth, and I should be expecting this anyways because there's going to be a great falling away from other Christians, or there's going to be a rise in attitudes against the church. So it's
What a
like,
win-win.
yeah, I mean, it's that whole of persecution um,
Complex, you know.
complex that people talk about. A lot of that stems from their view of eschatology. They see it as validating, and so they just keep doing it. They keep posting these sometimes divisive views on Facebook, and then whenever they get people calling them out, they're like, "Oh, well, that's just uh, verifying my position and affirming my ideas because I should be expecting that." But it's not going to matter because at the end of the day, I'm going to be proved right. But it also, I mean, it's just not healthy in terms of how we approach relationships with other people.
No, not at all.
Yeah. It's and I don't know how to explain it though, because again, this is one of those points where there's several divergent
Yeah,
views within
exactly.
fundamentalism. So I don't want to get too specific on
Well,
the instances, but
can we just talk about the idea of self superiority and like
yes.
the self righteousness is really what it feels like at times. Like
Yeah.
I am sharing the gospel with you, and the only failure I can really take is that I didn't articulate it clearly enough. But if I do articulate it, what I perceive clearly, and you reject it, it's because you're just not either one part of the elect because there's a Calvinist spin, or two, you know what I mean? Like you've succumbed. I guess it would technically be the same thing as one, but you succumb to secularism. And if I do get you on board to buy into this, then great. Come get on my. Dr. Leth said this at all of that. My lifeboat. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Like come join my lifeboat, and then we'll just like get on this boat together, and everybody else will drown, and then we'll just kind of slip away. There's a Noah's Ark parallel here, I'm sure that I'm missing, but you know what I mean. Like it's just going to be a hard
Yeah.
reset. It's actually kind of interesting because like this isn't supposed to be political, but it's just weird because environmentalism is now like a religious political thing, and it
Hmm.
historically wasn't.
Yeah.
You know,
It never was until the last maybe 50 years or so.
yeah, and like we can talk about like reasons why in politics like that might happen, but for this group of people, for the fundamentalists, it has nothing to do with like oil and money and business. Those are the typical discussions really centers
Hmm.
on, right?
Yeah.
Or the validity of the science. For them, it centers on it doesn't matter, and if it does, maybe that's just the end time event because God's going to bring us up to heaven with the rapture. We've
Yeah.
talked about this
And
before.
he's going to create a brand new heaven and a new earth. So it doesn't matter how we treat this planet.
Yeah,
Like fundamentalism overtly says that.
yeah.
Like it's not even like us trying to set up a straw man.
No, like
Like that is
it's
the position.
I'm not maybe not every fundamentalist, but there is a contingent and actually a very strong contingent of fundamentalists that do say that, which is
Yeah.
it's just weird because like it's funny because like interesting enough, like someone like who's like a hero of the faith that we like really talk about. I'm gonna call him a evangelical saint, even though we don't have those. Like C.S. Lewis, like he
Yeah.
like wrestles with like he wrote an entire book about it, like the Great Divorce, right? Is like illustrative of that, or like the Last Battle of the Narnia series. Read that if you haven't already. Read the whole Narnia series and finish with the Last Battle, and like try not to cry. But like this vision that like inside like God brings in this new world and like you go to Narnia and it's deeper and you go inward and upward and as you get deeper into the world it gets more vivid and bright and in that time like humans are talking to these other like animals like they're literally running through the fields of like what is the new earth, the new Narnia, right? Which is this is the vision of Revelation, right? This is
Mhm.
what we believe as Christians upon the resurrection, the new making of the new earth, that redeemed state, that this planet matters. And it's really interesting because like in some sense like they lose that beauty of like being able to have that life. Like this sounds stupid, I look forward, I never really got to spend a lot of time hanging out with my grandpa, but he's like one of the most important people in my life. But he adopted my dad when he was like over 40, and so
Hmm.
my parents waited till they were almost 30 till they had me. So my grandpa was basically 70 when I was born. So like he was in his 90s. He would have been in his 90s when I went to college, and he passed away when I was in middle school. And he lived like a hour away. So I didn't spend a lot of time with him, but he had a big influence on me when I did spend time with him. I'm looking forward to someday walking because my grandpa loved nature. He actually majored in horticulture at Purdue,
Hmm.
and he owned an apple orchard because he loved growing things. He should have like he is the true Midwesterner. He loved to be outside and farm, and he loved to have his hands in the dirt. I look forward to growing things and to like and walking through nature with my grandpa and seeing what like he how he sees it and hearing that and the new like
Hmm.
upon the resurrection. Like that's a vision that a dispensationalist doesn't like they don't have in the same way I do, right? Like we will walk through the orchard in Lafayette, Indiana together, and I will see how he sees it, and I will see it in its redeemed state. And that seems dumb and hopeful, but it is sappy, but it is true. Like it's a thing that I
Hmm.
look forward to, and I can have that hope. And that's a thing in my faith that I can hold to. Or moreover, like lost a couple dogs when I was a kid. Look forward to playing fetch with them again, or running with them, or whatever. You know what I mean? That sounds stupid again, but that's the beatific vision that like nature is made whole. And it continues a story that was told in Genesis when they talk about man as steward of the planet. And it's like a biblical mandate. Like God asks us to take care of this
Hmm.
world. This is my creation. It is as good as you and I. Like we hold a
Hmm.
special place in terms of the way he does his redemptive story, as like, not, I don't want to say arbiters, but like maybe leaders in that. But like, we're not exclusively the only thing that's going to be redeemed. You know what I mean? Does that make sense,
Hmm.
Ben?
Yeah. Yeah. And our salvation is the salvation of the world.
Mm.
Like God doesn't save us. God didn't save humanity just for the
Pastor
sake of
Ben with the
humanity,
mic
although
drop.
that is certainly a major aspect of it. But God saved humanity so that the rest of creation can be redeemed as well.
Dang, that's just that's a Pastor Ben hot mic drop right there. That's whoa, dude, that was nice. Wow, I loved it. I don't think anybody could have said it better. But like, and I think you got to cast those visions and you got to say those silly dreams, even if they feel stupid. But I think if I think it helps you know the character of God, and I think it helps you learn the hope that we really have as Christians. Because like, if God just ejects and it's a lifeboat, like, what was the point of all this? Is it feels like a game, and
Mhm.
then like
And suicide becomes a viable practice. I mean, really,
and truthfully,
theologically, it's hard to
I'm just joining Father soon.
it's hard to
That's
go against it.
yeah.
Yeah,
Or he'll forgive me, you know. I don't know, like something like that. So anyway,
but
um, the political stuff, the environmentalist stuff, and the deep ties to the end times is big stuff. So
mhm.
Ben, I know you had one last thing you wanted to share about fundamentalists, and they have a really unique, divisive view on something.
Yeah, so I'll go over this pretty quick, and then we can start wrapping up just for tonight. But yeah, fundamentalism is very unique. Part of what makes it a time capsule, a theological time capsule, and part of what I mentioned earlier, which is how insular they are, is that they are incredibly strict on what they understand as fellowship. And when I say fellowship, I mean people that they associate themselves with.
Mm,
So in many Christian traditions, they disagree with like other denominations, they will disagree with different theologies, but at the end of the day, if you put a group of Lutherans and a group of Protestant or a group of like Nazarenes, a group of Methodists, a group of Calvinists, a group of Reformed, Catholic, Orthodox, you put them all in a room most of the time, and I would say actually every time, they will all be able to say, you know, we can agree on Jesus Christ is our Lord and Savior. He is the Son of God. That he, you know, died and rose from the dead for our sins. And they can all come together and leave understanding each other as Christians, just different articulations of the faith,
yeah,
right? Like when you get down to it, even though they disagree. Fundamentalism does not do that.
you put the
Fundamentalism
fundamentals in
says,
them.
yeah, they say if you do not agree with the fundamentals, which are the 9 that I mentioned that we talked about before, then you are not a true Christian. You're not an Orthodox believer.
Yeah,
Um, so it's very cyclical in that
cyclical,
way. Is that a word?
cyclical.
Cyclical. Yeah, thank you. It's circular. That's what I was trying to
Ah,
say.
there we go.
It's very circular in that regard because the fundamentalism is based off the fundamentals, which were written by fundamentalists. And if you're not in that, then you are not even Orthodox Christian.
Like you can't
Like
even. Yeah,
you're basically, I mean, you're seen as, it's not just that you're seen as like a different type of Christian, you're seen as a heretic in the majority of fundamentalist circles.
mm-hmm.
So if you value the ancient traditions of the church, such as Catholicism or Orthodoxy or Coptic, no, you're a heretic. If you do not believe in the verbal inspiration of scriptures, that's going to be a lot of your Wesleyan traditions. That's going to be actually most
Say
Christian
like
traditions.
most, like almost all.
Basically anything but fundamentalism. Because verbal inspiration is pretty new, actually,
Yeah,
in terms of an idea. Um, the literal interpretation of Genesis, again, that's going to set you apart. So if you do not agree with those 10 things, then you are, and all 10 things, not just a few, all 10 things, if you don't agree with those, then you're a heretic.
yeah,
And so that's why I say it's very divisive, um, and very strictly so. Like they are very, very picky about who they define as real Christians, who they define as false Christians. So that's basically just what I wanted to say about that. It's
yeah.
a unique facet of fundamentalism.
Yeah, and I think it allows you to see others as like Have you ever heard? Have you ever read Martin Buber?
I don't know if I have. I'm familiar with him though.
Yeah, you should have because we took the same Theo classes at different
Okay,
times. But I know
then
Dr.
I
Left.
probably did read him.
Okay, all right, maybe you don't. But Martin Buber had like this theology of the other, and it was like an evangelism thing because he had a Jewish or a background in Judaism. I think he's a theologian. He might be a philosopher. Anyway, the idea simply is like talking about the other and self and whatever. And like one of the things that you can do is create distance between the other and self. You know what I mean? And I
Mhm.
keep thinking about like the implications of like fundamentalism in this worldview and like how other everything is. And like the reason that they're nationalists is because God has propped us up. And it's easy to look at like, a Muslim person as like a monster. It's actually easy.
Mhm.
It's actually fairly easy to look at me as a monster. um, you know what I mean? And it just kind of exacerbates some problematic and kind of, I don't know, Ben. How do you feel about that scary stuff? Like I feel that feels like, listen, I
Yeah.
don't agree with like the teachings of Islam, but I think Muslims are
Mhm.
monsters.
Yeah. I mean, I think we see this a lot in our political discourse.
Mm,
And this is not exclusive to fundamentalism, but I think this is a good example of what it's like to be in that view. Like, where even people within the same church are getting into huge discussions and people are leaving churches over, are we going to enforce a mask policy or not? Like stuff like that. Like incredibly divisive stuff. A lot of it. Even like opinions on, currently what's happening is the George Floyd Chauvin trial. Sorry, um, for those familiar with that. People have very different opinions about that, and sometimes it's like different circles. Like you're not even allowed an opinion on it. Like you have to think one way or the other. So we're living in a very divisive time, and it's sad, but that's also a little bit of what this mentality is like, to constantly treat the other as not just other but monster
yeah,
in
or
a
less
sense.
than, and you're righteous. And
Yeah.
I think that's just a general lesson. I think fundamentalism may have been one of the early adopters of that kind of mindset.
Hmm.
But I don't know. I think it's an interesting takeaway for us to think about like how we approach the people that we disagree with. And for the record,
Yeah.
that's not exclusive to conservatives. You
Right.
heard it here from a liberal. Uh, sorry to tell you. Uh, but like, you can't demonize like even, I mean, yeah, you shouldn't demonize. It is difficult, admittedly, like especially with fundamentalists in particular, because like it's hard to dialogue without a coherent set of facts and like
Hmm.
convincing them to take their base fundamental assumptions and redo them just to like
Yeah.
have the conversation that you were going to have to begin with is really difficult, if not even impossible.
Yeah.
So but the point remains here is that like we wanted to do the series because we were interested in fundamentalism.
Hmm.
We wanted to kind of get to the root, at least I wanted to get to the root of how and why they think, and kind of understand the implications and maybe figure out if I can know how they got here and why they got here.
Hmm.
And maybe if you're being exposed to these ideas, you'll have some better understanding of where they came from, because I don't know if
Yeah.
those are always articulated because they're just taught as fact.
Right.
Um,
Or
and
they're just there and people just assume, oh, that's the Christian view, when really it's like, no, 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 it's a very specific type of what we would call Christianity.
yeah,
Even though fundamentalism is honestly, this is going to sound like an insult, but I mean this very sincerely. It actually functions more in a cult mentality.
yeah, a little bit, actually, a little bit. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really fair. Um, Man, it sounds mean, but like I kind of like you can kind of see it though. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You kind of like,
I'm not saying that to be derogatory. I'm just in trying to think of what sort of model does it follow. It follows more a model of a cult than it does of the church.
yeah, I know you're not wrong. Actually, if you think about it, it's like, oh, I mean, they just do less crazy stuff,
Yeah.
maybe.
That's true. Like there's not weird like,
Well, I mean, even David Koresh was a some kind of premillennialist, like the guy down in
yeah.
Waco. He was kind of, they were fundamentalists technically,
Yeah.
sort of.
It's something to think about at least.
Anyway,
Maybe.
neither here nor
We
there.
might correct ourselves later. It doesn't matter.
Yeah,
If
we're
you
just
disagree, let us know.
spitballing ideas. Sorry, we this was
Yeah.
not planned. Uh, anyway, but that's why we wanted to dive into this, is we wanted to get an idea of what we were focusing on, kind of give you guys some exposure. And for those of you who maybe aren't of the faith that have just listened to our podcast to support us, one, we really appreciate listening. Thank you for taking the time to shut yourself and hear something different and treat us seriously. And two, please don't all lump all Christians in with that group, because we're not all the same. I swear. Uh, maybe one of the critiques of Christianity that's fair is all the denominations, but maybe there's a reason for that as well. So two things can be true. Ben, before I start running this off the rails, do you have anything you want to close us with?
No, not really. Just, leave a like if you liked it. Let us know your thoughts. If you come from a fundamentalist background and you're familiar with that, what we mean by that, and if what we've said resonates with you, and sort of what you've been taught. Let us know.
Yeah.
I'd be very curious to hear, your experience with it.
Yeah.
And maybe your experience is different. Maybe you're saying, yes, some of this stuff I grew up believing, but some of the stuff you guys articulated is very different from my experience.
Yeah.
We'd be interested in that
So
too.
correct us too. We're interested in learning that as well, both sides.
Yeah. And if there's anything you guys would like us to talk about, let us know. Be sure to share and subscribe, please. That would really help us out. And we will see you
Next week.
next time.